and welcome to the exhibition David Cronenberg, Transformation. Transformation, this exhibition, is part of a larger thing called the Cronenberg Project, organized by the Toronto International Film Festival. This is the first of a number of projects related to that. In November, TIFF will be organizing an exhibition of David Cronenberg's props and sets, and a full retrospective of his films and talks. That'll be in November. That's called David Cronenberg Evolution. November 2nd, we will be opening an exhibition in our project space for the National Gallery of Canada at the Museum of Contemporary Canadian Art program, or NGC of MOCCA. And David Cronenberg is curating that exhibition from the National Gallery collection. And all of these projects are going to have a publication associated, and that will be launched here at MOCCA on November 2nd as well. This exhibition, we invited 6 artists and commissioned most of the work. TIFF commissioned most of the work, invited artists to produce work inspired by David Cronenberg. The artists are Candice Breitz, who is here in our audience, and she'll be speaking after Jamie Shovlin, who is here. We also have Marcel Dzama, Jeremy Shaw, and Laurel Woodcock, and James Coupe. Also, hiker meat, rough cut. No, rough cut hiker meat. That's the work in the main space here. It's 5 flat screen monitors, and it's quite a complex work. I think you have to sit with the different headphones and listen to all the headphones. And you know, for the purpose of the catalog, for the publication, I've been thinking about that piece and writing about it, and speaking to Jamie about it, but it's a very complex work that I still haven't quite wrapped my head around. So perhaps, Jamie, I could put you on the spot and ask you to speak a little bit about that piece.
Happily. Well, hopefully. I think probably the best place for me to start with the project is the point at which the invitation to exhibit in this particular show intersects with the project is quite a late one. The project itself has been in development in some form or another since 2009. And I think the reason I think the point to begin there is that some of the decisions made at certain points in the past will and have influenced the way it is presented here, and the way it will formally and finally be presented at the end of this year when it's developed into a feature film. The work itself is a tricky one to describe. It kind of started as a project that was about the film, and the project was really central to the project. That the film that it talked about never existed. That there was this kind of mythological hole at the center of this project, and that this film would be referred to by various things within the project, each of which addressed this film, Haikami, which never existed, and somehow gave you a kind of jigsaw-like impression of what the film would be, or what the film would have been like had it existed. And it, as a project itself, has an earlier genesis in an even earlier work called Liss, which, without going into too much detail, was similarly an archive of a band who never existed and never produced any music. And Haikami's first appearance as a couple of works was 2005 during a project when it was written as, I think, their 7th album. Their 7th album was a concept album that dealt with a fictional horror film. So, part of the attraction of that project was taking this kind of aspect of a separate project that was incredibly minor. The way within that project Haikami as a thing was kind of formalized or contextualized was in a 300-word synopsis that was written by a guy I worked with called Mike Hart, And Haikami is an anagram of his name, and he effectively wrote Haikami. And he did that in a really contrived way. He wrote a narrative that kind of snaked around 7 subtitles. So he kind of wrote between these 7 titles and had to connect them to give this impression of the film. And the idea with his writing was because it needed to be generalized and it needed to be identifiably part of a very long-standing genre, and in this case that's the horror/exploitation genre, that he needed to kind of trade upon very standardized genre cliches. So we had this, and this is back into 2009 now, we had this 300-word description of this story, of this film that never existed and never was going to exist. And at a certain point, I think we decided it'd be interesting to take what was a very kind of informal idea, a very ill-considered idea on many levels, and to subject it to incredible development and pressure. So the first step in that was that Mike expanded this 300-word synopsis into around a 3,000-word synopsis. And then I think by this point we originally started this process with some consideration that we might actually make the film Haikami, whatever that would be. And around this point, in which there's a 3,000-word treatment becoming visible, we decided we don't really want to make a film. I think that the idea was we don't want to make a really bad horror film intentionally. But we were kind of interested in this thing that had already happened initially, which was a kind of deconstructive process that was being applied to the kind of mutation between different forms of adaptation and how those manifest as per the different personalities involved, different people involved. So from Mike's 3,000-word treatment, I condensed the action in that story into 60 scene types that were simply descriptive of action. So things like girl going to woods, a guy going to a cellar, and so on and so on. And we made a decision at this point that this would, for the time being anyway, be a film of films. It would be a kind of composite visual map of various films from, roughly speaking, mid-60s to mid-80s, what I kind of refer to as the kind of prime years of the exploitation genre. And so I built up this data bank of around, I think it was 1,500 clips in the end, each of which had some reference to one of these descriptive scene types, and each of which related further back to this original 300-word synopsis. And then I started to edit together these clips as faithful as possible, as possibly to Mike's original treatment, but obviously within the disjoint between something that's written on the paper and something which is taken from pre-existing films, these things change dramatically. And by this point, we decided we wanted to engage this process so that we could, as I mentioned at the beginning, create this absence, this hole in the middle of this project that would be what this film is. And a question I get asked a lot is, does Haikami exist? And the answer to that is, it depends what question you're asking in particular. So if you're talking about it as a film, it doesn't exist, but as a kind of means to an end, it does exist. This 18-minute long collage of, I think, ultimately around 900 film clips, each of which comes from a different film, does exist. And this exists primarily to give form to Mike's original written synopsis, and then secondarily to hand over, after the fact, to a studio to Foley reaction. So in collating all of these clips, the audio was dropped out. There's no sound to this collage. But the collage exists to be given to different studios and different people to complete the process, basically. So a studio in the UK called Universal Sound, who are exclusively a Foley studio, they Foleyed the entire film, the entire 80 minutes. Another collaborator, Ewan Roger, completed the score. We scored the entire film. And after the fact, Mike and myself wrote a script for the film that was back-synced to the characters' mouths moving in the original collage. So at the end of this process, and this is probably, I think, when Noah first saw the film, which would have been 2010 in Rome, we had these constituent parts of this process, and this constituent kind of refractive index of what this film was without the film ever existing. And similarly, around this time, I was approached by a gallery in the UK, Manchester, called Cornhouse, to contemplate, well, first of all, an exhibition, and secondarily, a feature film version of Haikumi, which initially seemed like the worst idea ever, because this project was entirely about feature films. It was entirely about the absence of the filmic, or the visual form in terms of moving image. And then gradually, it became clear that film would be the most effective way to condense all of these processes that took place in this 2 to 3 year period. So, with that lengthy backstory, to contextualize what is in the gallery here, we started to shoot Haikumi, or more specifically, we started to shoot elements of Haikumi, which are the opening sequence, which is about the first 7 minutes of the collage, the final 3 or 4 minutes of that collage, and then the trailer. So the idea being that you have the peripheries of this film, the beginning and the end, and then this thing that condenses the form into a very, very compressed ultra-narrative. So we started trying to shoot those shot for shot as per the original clips that they come from. And the kind of result of that process, or the result of the workings of that process, are what's presented in the gallery here. And the idea was always to, visually with this piece of work, was to, and the way the work is arranged in the space is, there's 5 screens. And the central screen within those 5 is effectively the kind of the final product, for want of a better term. And everything to the periphery is the preparation leading up to that, and the preparation in literal form of an extended take, and then the preparation in terms of interviews with Mike and Ewan, so Mike the writer and Ewan the composer. So these kind of bookends of this process, and also there's expanded pans across these documents that were important in this process. So I think that the primary one being a collection of 20 or so blackboards that are somewhere 25 meters wide, and that effectively are the kind of canonical document of this entire process, as they document this collaborative act between the 3 of us. And what the idea was, and this is, I guess, where the relationship to Cronenberg comes in. Because I kind of was approached mid-project, so it wasn't as if I was kind of approached on the basis of making something that reacted to Cronenberg. It was more, I think, a recognition of something stylistic, something sympathetic, conceptually between those, well, particularly his early films and this project. And I think it was this idea of how form mutates according to, on one hand, technology, and on the other hand, in what form that story is presented. So something literary, something that's on the page, something that's an expanded form of literary adaptation, as compared with something that is shot on video or shot on high-res digital and then made to look like a 16mm film, or like a thing littered with VHS artifacts. And this idea of identity within each of those contexts having this kind of mutational structure and this migrating structure between each of these forms. And I think what the work here effectively documents is the shooting of those 3 sequences, the opening, the closing, and the trailer. And the kind of technical facility that gives form to the work in this context is this idea of centrality, this idea of like a fixed form, and then taking that fixed form and deconstructing it and splintering it through showing the kind of the behind-the-scenes aspects of that process. So when if you work on a film shoot, there's this kind of activation moment when you're looking at a film where a shot is used, where it comes into use, and it ceases to be of use. And each of the screens that surrounds the action on the central screen is effectively pulling each of those shots, each of those takes to their literal beginning and end point. So taking the final document and taking it apart visually as you're watching it. So literally splintering the thing that you're looking at. And the idea was that would reflect the entire process of this project, and that would then be reflected in this exhibition by having 5 specific monitors, each with their own audio feed, depending on which one you're listening to. You're getting one of 5 takes of what you're looking at. So in a nutshell.
But you did start off right away by mentioning that the film Hiker Meat didn't exist. And when I started looking into this project and the material I had, that was not explicitly mentioned anywhere. And it was quite funny because I wasn't sure myself, but I kept asking. It was quite some time before I figured out that Hiker Meat didn't exist. So I kept asking Noah, but okay, does Hiker Meat exist? Is there a movie from the 1980s Hiker Meat? If I go down to Queen Video and ask them for Hiker Meat, are they going to have it? And of course Noah never just said yes or no, he started explaining it again. But even before I had seen the finished piece, it is interesting that this question that I had was, you know, what was real and what was fictional, which of course is something that's common in some of Cronenberg's films, Existence, for example, where fiction and reality get blurred together, leading to a question of our own understanding of things, of ourselves and the nature of the world. But I think what was I getting at there? Your previous work, I guess the body of work that you're known for is always about these mythological bodies of work. So I wonder, what is your interest in that? Essentially, you create, through the use of artifacts and archives and artworks, you create these fictions, these mythologies. If that's what I can say is, you know, kind of somewhat the essence of your work. So what is your interest in that type of fabrication?
I think I'm really interested in, and I think that's where it gets kind of confusing, this idea of how information travels. And probably the easiest way to condense that is to make something up. To, you know, create something that looks a lot like a lot of other things, but and shares a lot of commonalities with those things. But in doing so, the idea is kind of an attempt to condense what it is about whatever form that might be. And in this case, that's a, you know, horror film, exploitation film. Previously, it's been a music archive and a collection of drawings from a schoolgirl. And it's a kind of reflective process. It's this idea of what substantiates those things as, I guess a good way of describing authentic, and not necessarily, not strictly real with such a, you know, real and unreal or fake or fictive. It's more this notion of experience of a thing, and that might be a cultural event, that might be an object, it might be a connection, a collection of things that relate to either of those things. It's how do you reflect a thing through all of the support structure of, or the scaffold of meaning that constitutes it. And I tend to be drawn towards things that are, I guess, broadly speaking, culturally low. So things that wouldn't normally be commemorated in, you know, standardized archival displays or, you know, I don't know, biographical or, you know, cultural accounts. These things almost exist outside of culture. They either exist out of culture as a low form of culture, or they're so central, so mainstream culture that their populism means they're disregarded. And I'm really interested in what those things mean to people, and how, and a lot of the kind of starting point of these projects is what they mean to me. And Hiker Meat is born out of you know, a childhood, adolescent love of, you know, terrible slasher films. And there's this kind of secondary impulse as you get older to kind of understand what they did for you at that point in your life, and then secondarily to kind of then broaden that individual interest into something that's more cultural, something that's more across the spectrum of where they exist in society and where they exist in a particular time and space, and what that represents to presumably other people at the same time. And I think the way each of those things is addressed really in what I do is to create these collections of things that relate more often than not to something that didn't happen, or to something that is effectively a kind of condensation of the thing that's hard to put your finger on. So it's easy to do that in a kind of a creative or fictional method. It's kind of like the way I always relate is to writing a book. If you read a novel, you don't really question whether something is real or not. You just go. You're in the book. You're there. It either convinces you of its this individual structure. It's the kind of grammar it uses, the way it delivers information, and you're either there or you're not. You don't really second guess everything you're being told. I think because I work within the realm of objects, and objects point towards a kind of substantiated story that often isn't what it seems to be. There seems to be more of a kind of focus on the fact that I make things up. Whereas I'm increasingly working with things that are part of actual life and that maybe have been ignored, and presenting them in similar formats whereby the whole aspect of them being real or not is questionable, because it's more of interest to me in how they've got to be this thing. Who was determined that this information is delivered at a particular point in time, for what reason, and how might you use that endpoint as a starting point to go back into that information being generated for a particular point, for a particular reason.
And this rough cut hiker meet, is this is your latest work? And what do you have? Do you have any ideas for what you're up to next? What's the next mythology you're working on?
This project, it's always difficult for me to say this project will be complete, because these things tend to hang around for more time than that envisage. This project will be complete at the end of this year, early next year. It'll be a feature film by then, which will be called Rough Cut, and there'll be the final show of this entire project early next year at the Cowan House in Manchester. After that, that's a good question.
Holiday.
I'm not very good at holidays. I get bored, and so I start looking at things in a not kind of relaxing way. I've recently got really interested in newspaper archives, and particularly newspapers as this kind of ephemeral form, this thing that's probably going to become obsolete in the next couple of years, because the whole idea of ephemeral information presented in a material format is, it seems increasingly obsolete and obscure. So I spent a lot of time in the British Library newspaper archive lately, where all of these newspapers are presented on microfilms that are preserved forever, supposedly, and just taking kind of interest in how that information as a story, as a narrative, sits alongside its storage, its presentation as a material thing. And I think I'll probably go back into that. So that's kind of dealing with real things, but real things that are kind of more in process, as opposed to, I think the way I always define it is like a newspaper versus an encyclopedia. What's more faithful to delivery of information?
Well, yeah, of course, in the media as well. Speaking of confusion between fact and fiction. Okay, well, thank you very much, Jamie.
Thank you.
And her most recent work, Treatment, which is in the room next to us here, was just completed last Saturday, approximately. And that was commissioned by TIFF for this exhibition. And going through the exhibition, you'll notice that some of the work makes some direct references to Cronenberg, And in another case, the reference is perhaps a little more oblique, but in your case, Candice, you've selected a very specific scene from Cronenberg's The Brood.
This is a strange work for me, and more difficult, I think, than usual for me to speak about it, given my cast, which consists of myself, my mother, my father, and my therapist. It was a strange thing to be approached, to be asked to make a work in response to the work of another artist. Cronenberg is someone who I've always been interested in. I've always thought of him as a very intellectual filmmaker, and I have cut up a lot of film in my time, but I tend to avoid the directors who I really respect. I tend to hack up movies which maybe I hold with a little less regard. So it was a little daunting to sort of think about what I would want to do with Cronenberg. And I started out by watching every film he had ever made. I asked TIFF to send me a hard drive with his full filmography on it. And what sort of happened in doing that was that I had always felt that the sort of therapeutic relationship, the relationship between a doctor and a patient, sort of recurs across so many of these films. A large majority of these films involve some kind of interaction between a doctor and a patient, whether it's a gynecologist or a psychotherapist or any number of different doctors, including in his very early film called Transfer, which I think he made when he was still a student at Toronto University. And I had been thinking a lot about, I mean, to be honest, James kind of said a lot of what needs to be said here, so I'll try not to repeat too much of what he said, but I've always been very interested in the relationship between our experience outside of cinematic, outside of cinema, and how our experience is represented cinematically. And I think that that is definitely a looping relationship. Clearly our stories are told cinematically, and in turn we imbibe those narratives, absorb them, and surely they become formative for us in a variety of ways. So that kind of back and forth between real life, E-A-R-E-A-L, and real life, R-E-E-L, has been at the heart of much of my work. Having watched all of the films, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. Of course, the anxiety that you have as an artist when you're asked to make a work like this is that you don't want to just make a work which will only function in the context of this very interesting project, but nevertheless you want a work which will be your own and which will be able to have its own legs outside of the context that you're making it for. And so I ended up going with my earliest instincts. Before I watched all of these movies, I thought that I wanted to do something with The Brood. So I spent a whole week watching them and then ended up doing something with The Brood. But somewhere along the way, I read the story of The Brood. I hadn't known much about it. I'd always found it very compelling. And I read, there's a very interesting book called Cronenberg on Cronenberg, where he speaks a lot about, he sort of leads you through each of the films, what he was thinking about at the time, what led to certain decisions. And he mentions in this book that The Brood, I think it's fairly well known, probably more so in Toronto than elsewhere in the world, that this is probably Cronenberg's most autobiographical movie, in the sense that at the time that he made the movie, he was going through a very harrowing split up from his wife, and they were having a nasty fight for the custody of their daughter, which really is the essential plot of The Brood, a marriage that collapses and the child at the heart of that marriage as the parents fight over the child. So Cronenberg has called the movie his Kramer versus Kramer. Both movies were made in the same year. Kramer vs. Kramer happens to be a movie which I've cut up quite extensively myself in the past, in particular for a work called Mother and Father, which I made in 2005, in which I kind of snipped Meryl Streep and Dustin Hoffman out of Kramer vs. Kramer and put them into a sort of found footage, melodramatic kind of symphony of mothers and fathers. Anyway, that's another story, but that was irresistible to me. So, you know, this idea that Cronenberg was remaking Kramer vs. Kramer which he hated, which he found too sugar-coated and obviously too mainstream for his taste, too sentimental for his taste. So it's not only was he remaking that movie, but he was also telling his story without wanting to do so confessionally, without wanting to reveal. However, he says in this book that he chose his actors, Samantha Eggers and Art Hindle, because in his perception they had some kind of resemblance to himself and the wife that he was about to not be his wife any longer. And that kind of opened up for me into a space which interests me more generically. How is it that we translate our experience into moving images, and how is it that those moving images in turn impress themselves onto our lived experience? And so I thought, well, maybe this is an opportunity to sort of up the ante. There are all of these families lurking in this movie. I should tell you a little bit about the movie because it's a relatively obscure Cronenberg film. Not everyone has seen it. Essentially, as the car.
Not an easy one to watch.
It's a tough watch. It's a pretty tough watch, but very compelling. I would highly recommend it. As this marriage dissolves, the wife, Nola Carveth, collapses mentally, and she ends up in the hands of a sort of very renegade maverick psychotherapist called Dr. Hal Radlin, who's played with sort of bullish oafishness by Oliver Reed. And she pretty much spends the whole movie in treatment in this clinic. And he has, I won't go into his various methods of treatment because if you know Cronenberg, I don't think I should spoil it for you. But what I will say is that one of the things he does with his patients intensely is to encourage these very, very dense transferences and cross-transferences. So typically, we see, during the course of the movie, we see 3 scenes where Hal Radlin is literally treating a patient in therapy. Interestingly enough, he conducts some of these sessions publicly. So he'll be with his patient on stage and there'll be an auditorium of people watching, which is very cinematic, this idea of the therapy taking place in front of in an auditorium which might otherwise be used for theatre or film. And typically what he does is to play the role, there's a lot of role play involved, of the mother or the child or the father of the patient, so as to encourage the patient to return to traumatic family encounters, memories, traumas. And so essentially what I've done is, there's a lot of other stuff too. There's a lot of special effects, and there's a lot of gore, and there's a lot of blood, and there's a lot of sort of mutant, asexual dwarves, and there's a lot of the kind of stuff that we expect of that moment in Cronenberg's oeuvre, less so more recently. That wasn't the stuff that interested me at all. What interested me was the sheer horror that is embedded potentially in family relationships. And when you strip that movie bare of all of the sort of typical Cronenbergia, what you're left with are some fairly universal dialogues around the sort of the brutality of family psychology and how intense that can be and how that loops. So typically, the main character, the wife, has been abused by her mother and abuses her daughter. And there you have that classic loop, which is endemic to horror movies. I mean, horror movies often end on a cliffhanger where you sort of know that what's happened in the past is going to happen again, whether it gets carried on in a character or in a sequel or whatever the case may be. And I maybe will just read to you very briefly, if I can find on my phone, a particular quote from Cronenberg which got me thinking. He said, "The Brood is the most classic horror film I've done. The circular structure, generation unto generation. The idea that you think it's over, and then suddenly you realize that it's just starting again. That's classic horror movie structure. It is classic horror movie structure, but it's also the classic structure of psychological trauma, the return to trauma and the looping of the mind, the life of the mind looping and looping and returning and reprocessing and recycling. And so somehow I was interested in that overlap between the cinematic and the psychological. And I thought, well, what can I do with these scenes? I decided to extract these 3 scenes which specifically engaged the therapeutic dialogue from the movie. Each of them gives us Oliver Reed in the guise of Dr. Hal Raglan, playing out a series of transferences with one of his patients. And I thought that I'd do something fairly simple. I thought that I'd give these scenes a new soundtrack, and I would re-record the soundtrack of the movie. And I decided that I would invite my own therapist, someone who I've been in therapy with for the last 5 years, to re-voice Oliver Reed, and ask my parents and myself to re-voice the patients. The content of these scenes is very much about the relationship between parents and children in both directions. There's one amazing scene where my mom is the patient, and where she flips halfway through the scene from speaking about herself as a mother to speaking about herself as a child, which I found very interesting. And I think, you know, I think that maybe we'll just leave it at that, because that gives you a sense of where I'm coming from. And the work is so fresh for me, and it literally was completed a week ago, so maybe it's more interesting for us to open up and for me to respond to angles that might interest you, instead of continuing to sort of
well, I mean, speaking of trauma and family trauma, I mean, that took some nerve or some anxiety on your part to cast yourself and your mother and your therapist in those roles. And that's a very harrowing scene in the movie.
3 scenes.
What's that?
3 scenes.
Yeah. It's I found it even more creepy and more effective than some of the more obvious creatures that are emerging from bodies in that movie. I have to say it was. I found it difficult the first couple of times, even sitting through your work. But the idea of casting yourself in there, I mean, because that's not something you generally do in your work.
I haven't often. I don't like. I prefer being on the controlling side of the camera. In this case, I got to do both. I got to direct and to act. You know, I've just come directly from seeing the Steve McQueen movie, 12 Years a Slave, and it is so effective and so powerful in the way that it grapples with the sort of period of plantation slavery. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that is because I've never been interested. A lot of my work circles around mainstream cinema and dissects it and takes it apart and puts it back together again. But I've never wanted to do only that. I've never wanted to just sort of, from an analytical remove, to just, I think there's a lot of that in the contemporary art community. A lot of artists work with film at a sort of clever remove, at a very clever remove. And I've always been interested in trying to, obviously, I would like to have some clever remove for myself, but I've also been interested in the affect and in trying to understand, and I think Jamie put this very well, this is a huge culture. Millions of people watch these movies. Millions of people are invested in mainstream movies. I'm not suggesting that The Brood is a mainstream movie. What is the nature of that affect? Why is it that we can, how is it that we are often very deeply affected, negatively or positively, by films? And I've been interested in my work in trying to tap into that affect, not necessarily so as to explain it away, as a kind of sort of the manipulation of mass culture and all of that sort of clever Adornian interpretation, which I think is perfectly legitimate, but it doesn't explain away the effect and what movies can make us feel. I sat crying for an hour through this movie this morning. I knew it was a fiction. I've met some of the actors. I know Steve McQueen, and yet that suspension of disbelief fascinates me, because obviously, as is the case with literature, the way that a good story can interpolate you into an identification which transcends your understanding of the fact that this is a fiction, this is just a movie, just a book. That fascinates me, that affect. And I guess that there was a little bit of prophylaxis in there, because one thing that Cronenberg says in this book of interviews is he says that when artists make work, they're always revealing themselves. Sometimes it's more obvious than in other times. When Tracy Emin makes a work about all of the people she slept with, that's perhaps a more obvious strategy in terms of sort of self-narration. But you're always somehow telling your own story as an artist. And what I liked about Cronenberg's approach in The Brood is that he does tell his own story. He himself was going through a divorce. He was fighting for the custody of his daughter. By the way, the name of the child in the movie is Candice. And my name is Candice, so that was perfect, guys. Thanks, David. So again, and the movie was made when I was, at the time that the movie was made, I was the same age as this child is in the movie, Candice in the movie. My father is the same age as David Cronenberg, so I was perfect killing of the father opportunity right there.
So much for the suspension of disbelief you were referring to.
So I guess what I like about The Brood is that it does tell his story, but it doesn't. It doesn't reveal anything about Cronenberg and his wife, and yet it was for him a way of working through a very harrowing and very real life experience. And I guess I wanted to have a stab at the same thing. I wanted to use specifically my parents and my therapist, and I without wanting to reveal too much about them or expose them too much or reveal too much about my relationships with them or the therapist. I wanted to have it both ways. I wanted that very, very intensely personal element, which is brought to the piece by the fact that they are my parents and my therapist. But then I wanted to sort of set up a wall right there and to have them be another family. You know, the Breitz family, the fictional Carver family, the family in Kramer versus Kramer, and then my family sort of painted on to that layering of families. I don't think I really answered your question, but...
Do I have a question there? Yeah, but it's he didn't cast himself in the movie, and you did, and you did in your segment. But interestingly, your dialogue is from his movie, so it's not your dialogue either.
Yeah.
So again, when you're talking about the cyclical nature, these cycles, or this loop, is what you refer to it as, a loop of trauma. Is that?
Well, I mean, that's the prophylaxis, right? Because on the one hand, I give you my mom and dad on a platter. On the other hand, they are they're speaking a script which was written in 1979 in Toronto. So it's not their story that they're voicing. They're notice how I'm leaving myself out of this and pretending.
Yeah, that's what my questions keep trying to get at.
You're not going to call me on this one.
Okay, all right. Yeah, you're a little too smart for that. But that's interesting that the movie was done in Toronto, and you're presenting this piece for the first time in Toronto.
Absolutely.
Bit of coincidence there, I guess. So there's a yes.
For Candice, did David Cronenberg comment on your work?
Yes, he said he found it very interesting how I had violated and mutilated him. So I took that as a compliment. Yeah. No, I mean, he was very generous about it, and I think that he understood the kind of logic of the work. He said to me that, you know, artists are cannibalistic. None of us create our work in a vacuum. And that's certainly more obvious when artists work with found footage or where they cite the world or quote the world immediately. But all of us cannibalize others, consciously or not. And that was mostly what Dave and I spoke about, and he was very respectful and generous and was happy to be violated as far as I could engage.
Well, I think he came to the gallery a couple hours before the opening. He said he wanted to see the work before he met the artist so he could have something to say. But he also did seem kind of overwhelmed with this whole Cronenberg project and the idea that that artists take inspiration from him. which was a conversation I was having with him, and he said, perhaps I should be charging an inspiration fee.
Yeah.
Well, that's the business.
Any other questions out there? Yes, Bill?
Hi. For both of you, I just wanted to know, do you have a favorite Cronenberg movie now that you have seen them all, and or a character that resonates with you across his films or something like that?
I think it's a strange thing because I watched it the other day and it kind of reminded me it wasn't the greatest film ever, but Shivers was when I first experienced the film. The films of Cronenberg was my favourite. It was made 4 years before I was born, and I watched it. My kind of primary memory of watching that film is very, very bad copies of VHS, and I watched it in theatre the other day for the first time, and it's kind of really bad, but in a really enjoyable way. And I don't know, it's a Rogers and Luke, the lead character, who is a doctor, he was a songwriter, I think, rather than an actor, Paul Hampton, I think. I just kind of was amazed that he was the lead actor, because he was like the worst choice for a lead of any kind of film, and I was hypnotized by how bad he was, and, but in a really good way, and it kind of, it's a weird thing, it's more of a, I guess, less of a relationship to the film, and more of a relationship to the experience of first encountering it. And when I was, I don't know, 12 or whatever I was when I first watched that film, I wasn't being critical in any way. I was just, there's this worm thing that latches onto people's faces, and probably when in the nude scenes. Sorry. But I think so. I had that weird recurrence with that film, and then I really like Eastern Promises, just because it's a really nice kind of arc of the career, I guess, to see a film that is incredibly formally strong and very well written, but shows the kind of the idiosyncrasies that he has as a writer and he has as a director, and manages to do it in a really classical format and still maintain that kind of integrity within what he does as a director.
The Bird is my favorite. I'm very bad at picking favorite characters. That's too hard. I'm not good at top 3s and top 10s, and there's far too many interesting characters in Cronenberg's movies.
Yeah, I had a question for you. I haven't seen your work in its entirety yet, but I plan to after this talk. But I was kind of interested in a couple elements of your process in this work, and one of them, you spoke about this, the repetition of trauma and this kind of looping and how it related to horror movies, and this looping, this thing that happens kind of repeats, and that comes through in family trauma. And then also your choice to, I guess, use your family and your therapist. And that there's this process of, I guess, realization that always comes, or revolution in some way that comes through in work. I was wondering, but that, you said that you wanted to also have some kind of distance from yourself completely, coming through the work. But I'm wondering if you did have some intention of kind of like personal movement or some sort of desire to break from this repetition of trauma, and like by using your family and your therapist, was there ever kind of a desire for therapeutic process, like personal therapy in this work?
Well, I mean, I think I think, I don't want to generalize, but I think that the process of making always affects one. I certainly didn't start out with a particular goal or a particular issue or trauma that I wanted to work through. I mean, my work is always my work always loops obsessively. That's sort of the nature of what I do. And I'm very interested in the relationship between the loop as we experience it in video installation and the psychological loop, that structure that we've come to accept as the sort of one of the most common ways of installing the video, because it means that you often step into a video installation when it's in the middle, not at the end or the beginning. And so that kind of sense of the sort of easy narrative that moves from beginning to middle to end is eliminated by the sort of technical formal structure of the installation if you choose as an artist to loop your work. And I've always kind of wanted to think about that in terms of how it affects your experience. I'm not going to speak about my personal, issues, but I mean, I am tempted to think, now that I've made this work, I'm not quite sure whether I'll be able to go back into therapy with this therapist, as brilliant as she is. So maybe this was my incredibly complex way of finishing therapy. I don't know yet. We'll see.
Question for Jamie. Where was your movie shot?
Where's the shot?
Yeah.
North England.
No.
So it's North England trying to look like Italy, trying to look like North America. But around that way.
So you got a car with a left-hand side steering?
Yeah, I mean, if you watch it closely, one of the cars is right-hand drive, and the hiker gets into the driver's side door, but we cut it really quick. So you don't see her actually get in, she goes in the other seat. But if those kind of things were really, I would say intentional, but they were allowed to happen, because they're the kind of breakage points where, the flag, and I think most of the roads, if you look closely, you see the signage, if it's ever visible, is wrong. And it's not reversed, it's kind of, there are certain things, we put false metal plates on every car, and you kind of meet some interesting people when you source vintage cars in the north of England, because they're not that commonplace. Kind of added to it.
Well, thank you very much, Candice and Jamie, and thanks everybody for coming.